Everyone, thank you for joining. We'll get started in just about a minute to let everyone join. Okay, why don't we get started? Seth, I'll pass it off to you to start the session.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody. Hey, Seth Carmody here. I'll be your most excellent MC and host for today's Medcrypt's Ask Me Anything. Um, we're paying homage to one of our favorite social media platforms, Reddit. We'll be talking about some pre-selected questions or pre-given questions, and then opening the floor for you attendees to ask us anything. We can cover a lot of topics today. But first, I want to introduce our speakers, starting with Axel Wirth. Axel, do you want to introduce us to yourself, if folks haven't already heard of you?
Thanks, Seth, and thanks everybody for joining today. Pleasure to be here. I'm the Chief Security Strategist here at Medcrypt. Have been here 5.5 years now. Prior to that, spent about 12 years in cybersecurity at Symantec, and prior to that, many years working for a variety of medical device manufacturers, and also do a lot of industry and standards work across AMI, IEEE, various organizations. Wrote a book on the topic of medical device cybersecurity, and like to attend events, virtual and physical, and contribute to the larger knowledge of the industry.
Thanks, Axel. And Axel's in the Massachusetts area, so if you ever want to grab coffee with Axel, I'm going to volunteer you. Axel, you refuse the request you want to refuse. Look him up, go get some coffee, learn something from Axel Wirth. Next on our list, Naomi Schwartz. Naomi, you want to give a little bit of intro to yourself?
Sure. I joined Medcrypt 2.5 years ago from 6.5 years at FDA, where I was reviewing a lot of diabetes diagnostic and therapeutic devices, along with chemistry and toxicology IVDs. Now that I'm here at Medcrypt, I'm excited because I get to do the same kind of work that I did at FDA, but I get to tell you not only what's wrong with your thing, but how to fix it, which, FDA has certain restrictions on and is just not something that I was allowed to do. And as an engineer, breaking things is something I love to do, but fixing them is sometimes more challenging. And I really enjoy being able to help people understand how to do the fixing part, and what the trade-offs are that you have to consider and face. Prior to that, I was a radar engineer for 15 years, so I actually know how to build stuff. I've built a lot of things. I've done a lot of independent verification and validation, a lot of really wacky field tests, which I can't tell you much about. But when we talk about what to do to get through FDA or other regulators, or even just how to do the right thing, we have to account for your actual engineering processes. So as we talk about these things, I'm keeping the actual engineering and R&D side of the life cycle in mind. It's really important to do that. Back to you, Seth.
Excellent. And last but not least, I am Seth Carmody. I'm probably most well known for being what I want to call it, chief policy architect at FDA during my tenure there, writing principally the pre and post market cybersecurity guidances, and also some of the first drafts of what became, I guess, the law that got passed on the end of 2022, joined Medcrypt in 2020, looking to catalyze a low cost but effective security solutions for the industry. Yeah, and we're here today to talk, broadly speaking, about medical device cybersecurity, which I think we have a wealth of experience on. I guess we could have called it Ask Us Anything. And you did provide us with questions, so we're going to dive into those now. I'm just going to jump into the first one here. Naomi, We got a question here. How much flexibility is there for risk-based application of cybersecurity requirements, and which docs are flexible? Maybe you can give us some insights there.
Yeah, FDA has statutory authority over cyber devices, but they also have this guidance that tells you a whole bunch of things that are not explicitly in the statute. So if you are a cyber device, please consider including a little bit of everything that the guidance asks for. Is there flexibility about a risk-based approach? Yes. How easy is it to convince FDA of your approach? That's a little bit trickier. If you're not a cyber device, guess what? You should still think that the guidance applies to you. Why? Because if you have software in it, even if you're not connected to the internet, if there is any single interface that I can get my hands on that allows me to connect you to the internet, even if you didn't mean for it to happen, you're now connected to the internet. So you should just really consider if you have software, you could be vulnerable, you should do something about it. Um, can you avoid certain documents? Yes. You're going to have to be really detailed about the elements based on your risks and give a really comprehensive explanation for why, if you have a really low risk device, you think certain documents don't apply, or better yet, just explain your thinking through each of the documents that FDA asks for, but you might have a much shorter, submission with respect to that document. If you're filing a 510(k) though, and you're mandatory to submit through eSTAR, you're not going to get eSTAR to actually accept your thing if it's a cyber device. If you have 0 attachments, or if each of your attachments is a blank page, you're going to fail in the technical screening within the first few days that FDA reviews it. If each of your documents is a single paragraph that says, we don't believe this applies, I think you're still going to fail in the technical screen. So you really do need to have some explanation for, what is your risk management thinking? What are your processes? What are you going to do about cybersecurity lifecycle management overall? Even if you don't get into a great level of detail, you need to have some kind of a threat model. If you have no threat model, you can have problems.
Yeah, thanks, Naomi. I think that's helpful. And just to give a little bit of uh, history on the development of the guidance itself. uh, One of the things that we knew we needed to do as a risk-based and promote and protect the public health agency was, what are the processes that we need to establish, and what artifacts do we need to observe out of those processes in order to have confidence that the security was appropriate given and that it was commensurate with risk. And so that document set that you're referring to is, hey, we want to see the artifacts of that process. Um, and we got into long discussions about, okay, well, if it's a thermometer that is on the shelf at CVS, what should I do? Should I not do certain things? And what we came to the conclusion was, it's like, no, you should actually do a threat model, and the threat model and those activities will be proportional to the risk incurred by a I don't want to say CVSS thermometer. You can tell you're in vulnerability management too long when you confuse CVS with CVSSS. So what's the difference between, there is a difference from a threat perspective between a thermometer that is off the shelf at CVS and a thermometer that is, in a control loop in some other safety critical system. So it tends to scale with risk. And if you think about it that way, we have to do it, but the length of the number of pages will probably reflect the risk overall in the number of interfaces. Cool. Moving right along here, and folks, encourage you, if you want to interact with us, to submit into the webinar chat there. We will make our best attempt to get to any questions that you may have, or if you need any clarifications. Moving on to the next pre-submitted question. This is an interesting one, Naomi. I love this one. The use of likelihood is discouraged by the FDA, but the standards still hold. Fill us in.
Right. Well, this is an important point where the FDA review staff haven't fully absorbed the content of all the standards that the FDA guidance cites. And on this particular element, there are a lot of scientists at FDA who equate likelihood immediately to probabilistic model. Not shockingly, right? When we're talking about the term likelihood of exploitation as used in not one, not two, but I believe 3 of the standards that FDA cites, those are actually the words that those standards use. You can equate that to a different term, exploitability in general, and use that term instead. But it's not wrong for you to use the term likelihood of exploitation. It is wrong for FDA to give you a deficiency that says you're using a probabilistic model solely on that basis. What are we doing about that? Well, we're educating FDA by stating in our submissions now, this is not a probabilistic model. It is a semi-quantitative scaling of the likelihood of exploitation based on XYZ criteria, whether you're using CVSS vectors to help you generate that number or some other methodology. Explain what you're doing, explain why it's not probabilistic. FDA will eventually catch up with us. We have been sharing feedback. We, Medcrypt, have been sharing feedback with FDA leadership when we're seeing this persisting, to let them know that there are review divisions that are not catching up. But you absolutely can use the term likelihood of exploitation. And it is not the same thing as a probabilistic model.
Axel, anything to add?
Yeah, so I think another important differentiator is also whether, depending on where you are in your process, whether you're taking a vulnerability-centric view of the problem or a risk-centric view. And what I mean by that is that as I design a new product, I'm still in pre-market, I really need to look at the vulnerability and whether it is exploitable by some future threat, by some future malware that may not even exist today. Right? Their exploitability is, I think, the right mental model. But if you're in the post-market, for example, and there are actual threats you need to consider, you may have an issue with, for example, an incident that indicates a vulnerability you had previously not discovered. There you need to look at likelihood as a broader risk concept, because indeed you already have a threat that needs to be considered as well as the vulnerability.
Yeah, it's a great point, Axel, and just to add a little bit more. I always love the history lessons because I feel like it's almost like a game of telephone, right? When these were conceived in policy, uh, and I'm not there anymore to guide them. Some veer in a different direction than maybe you originally intended. But the original problem that we had was that companies were coming to us and they said, this risk is never going to happen because the probability of failure is 10 times, 1 times 10 to the -7. And all we asked was, well, what's the scientific basis for this number? And I love numbers. I love quantification. It's not to say that there isn't a probability of exploit. In fact, there is. It's just how are you coming to this number and justify it, right? And I think at the time, this was vintage, 2016 vintage. We just as an industry, we weren't in a spot that we could use numbers that we could readily back up. So that's kind of where the gist of that policy item came from. Quick hitter here. Will it be okay to use CVSS 4.0 for risk scoring?
Absolutely. You should note that FDA actually recognizes the CVSS 4.0 approach in their database of recognized consensus standards. They still recognize 3.0. They never officially recognized or anti-recognized 2.0. So if you're using 2.0, just keep in mind that it's 2 versions stale and maybe you should update to a newer version. But 4.0 is the recommended approach. And we have a great question in the Q&A. Is it for risk scoring or vulnerability scoring? Well, it is defined as vulnerability scoring. It doesn't understand the risk of your device. So if you use it for risk scoring, use it for exploitability elements only. And then you have to carry that through your risk management process. And we're going to talk more about risk management process in a little bit, so I'm not going to get too much deeper into that. But this is really a focus on what is your likelihood of exploitation based on these metrics that you're pulling out of CVSS. And it does not reflect safety impact or anything associated with that.
Yeah, an interesting tip. I guess I'm going to be like the history guy. So I'm just going to own the role here. So if we think back, if folks remember when the post-market guidance was being built or socialized, this was probably 2015. Wow, it's been 10 years. We should have some sort of party or a party and get rid of, to modify the post-market. It seems a bit stale these days, but one thing that has held true is we had the graph there. If you go back and look at it, it says, exploitability on the y-axis. It has severity of patient harm on the x-axis. I think roughly speaking, that holds true in terms of process. It's not exactly specific and sort of the devil's in the details, but I think to germane to the question that was asked, exactly, exploitability is using those CVSS metrics. How bad is the vulnerability? What is its application to health, right? Deriving from 14971 and those derivatives is where we wanted to aim policy-wise, and it held up, I think, for the most part. Cool. Pivoting to the next question here. I think FDA's pre-market guidance describes what must be present in the submission, but on the other hand, would you share some of the things that must not be included in the submission, things that put at risk the submission? Naomi, why don't you take it?
Sure. This is a fascinating question. The short fundamental answer to this is things that you should not put in your submission. Don't put anything in your submission that is not true. Um, you laugh, but I've actually seen it, and no joke, like that's how warning letters are created, and that's how import alerts occur, and interventions where FDA comes in and inspects you for data integrity issues. But more than that, what else should you not put into a submission? Please don't share with FDA pseudocode or actual software code. Again, I'm not joking. I have seen this before. Pseudocode, pages of MATLAB code. I can read them, and you don't want me to actually check your code because if I find a mistake, I'm going to call you on it. But also, FDA doesn't want to see that. They want to understand your architecture in terms of diagrams or prose equations so that they can sort of get a sense for what you're doing. They don't want to read your code. But if you include it, they might. And if they might find something, and that's bad. They might also just call you out on having really poor coding standards. Been there, done that. I've given people grief. So don't include things that aren't actually necessary for FDA's review. Um, but beyond that, I want to go back to the word must. The question says, describe what must be present in the submission based on the guidance. Technically, the guidance is not a set of requirements, it's a set of recommendations. The statute is a set of requirements. So you must include the things that are in the statute if you're a cyber device. You should include everything in the guidance based on that scaling that we talked about before.
Yeah, it's interesting how yeah, you can create friction if you provide, I think one of the major pieces of friction, at least when I was a reviewer, and as I tell people broadly, I was never a good reviewer. That's why I got a reviewer when it's policy. Not sure what the record it will hold for policy, but it's still ongoing, still collecting data. When I was a reviewer, we would get data dumps, right? So I think it's actually an interesting question, right? Because I do think being selective about what you provide helps the reviewer. Don't, overload them with information that's superfluous. Really just focus on, I think the E-Star checklist is for cybersecurity perspective, really narrows down exactly what those artifacts from the SDLC that are required. Um, uh, we are flying through the time here, so I just want to make sure we do get to folks' questions and anything that comes up in the chat. Axel, want to take a stab at the next one? How do you vet or determine when a medical device threat model is done enough for a submission? I love this one. Axel, take it away.
Yeah, I mean, lots of good questions here, clearly. And admittedly, we as an industry, and I include the FDA actually in that broader definition, we're still learning, right? There are a lot of questions, including when is the threat model done? When are you done with your pen testing? When are you done with your SBOM, right? How many levels deep do you need to go with your SBOM? Clearly, we need to recognize that, we are still driving with the training wheels on, and we're slowly, in the process of taking them off. We need to mature. We need to understand what makes sense and results in better security as compared to what is just, busy work. So I can't give a, specific answer, but obviously your threat model should be accurately reflecting your product, should not have any obvious compromises. You should be able to confidently say, yes, I have considered all use cases, clinical and non-clinical, in my threat model, and I'm confident that it is sufficient in its approach. and then iterate from there, right? Every time you take a next step, you learn, right? You will learn, for example, when you pen test and you find something you overlooked in your threat model. That will happen probably for a beginner more often than for somebody who has been at it for a while. You will learn when you submit to the FDA and the FDA comes back with questions. They say, yeah, you did a great job in threat modeling your clinical use case, but how about your software updates? How about your fail-safe mode, was that included in your threat model? So, I mean, put a stake in the ground, be confident in an initial approach that you can defend, but be prepared to learn.
Yeah, I think the key that you're putting forth, Axel, is a good one, and I think where folks get into trouble is I would say largely ignoring parts of the system or interfaces they deem to be unnecessary, right? Oh, we're not gonna Bluetooth is installed, but we're not turning it on. It's like, well, the threat Bluetooth still has to be part of your threat model. Or, hey, we've got this repo over here and it's connected, but it's not part of the indications for use, right? So for whatever reason, things are de-scoped that are connected and then not included, and then may pop up in an architecture diagram, and then the subsequent question gets asked. It doesn't say that it's bad. It's just like, how are you choosing what to include in scope becomes critical for that first iteration. You also said something really important, Axel, and that is that it's iterative, right? So you keep working it. The SDLC should feed back into that threat model, so it's a continually living, breathing thing. Cool. Moving right along here, and I know we got some questions in the chat. Looks like we've got Axel and Naomi answering those via type, so they can continue to work here while I ask the following. But some of my clients ask if an IDE submission preclinical devices will require full cybersecurity docs. My answer has been to at least start the process to show FDA what has been done to date. It's cheaper to do it this way, in my mind. Naomi.
Yeah, I agree with the overall thinking about always starting the process, but we also have to consider the fact that there's multiple different types of IDEs and there's sort of different stages of where you're at in your development life cycle. When you're doing a feasibility study, you need the least amount of supporting evidence. As you're getting into your pivotal, you kind of have to be at the point where you're at a final finished design though, because of issues with respect to, FDA calling you out and saying you're changing your device in substantial enough ways that the clinical data you collect before the change may actually not be applicable to performance claims about the device when it is finished. So you have to be very, very careful about that particular element. But should you start documenting your cybersecurity processes as you're going into a feasibility study? Absolutely. How detailed you need to be, that depends on how risky it is. The key single word that FDA is looking at during IDEs is safety. Safety, safety, safety. We could say it all day long, but they're looking at safety. The additional considerations they may include in their review of your IDE will be related to your pre-market submission that's associated with the clinical studies you're doing. So they'll give you a whole bunch of additional considerations or not, depending on how much time they have and how many thoughts they have about what you're doing, where they're going to tell you all the things that they want to see for the next iteration or in your pre-market submission. You don't necessarily have to complete a threat model right away, but if you're not already preparing it and thinking about it and finding problems, you may end up having to do a redesign. So this is both a balancing act in terms of your timeline and your engineering lifecycle, and like, do you have the people who can do it? Do you need help doing it? Do you recognize that you need that help? Can you go find somebody to help you? By the way, if you need that kind of help, let me know. Um, Fundamentally, you want to make sure you have valid data collected during your studies that you can point to your design and say, no changes in my design are affecting the validity of that data. If you fail to do that, you're going to have a problem, and nobody wants to do a second clinical study because they didn't account for a change.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in your answer, Naomi, you touched on it, right? Like I think there's a certain, if you want to look at this as sort of a SDLC, at least draft output set of artifacts, I would point people towards threat model, cybersecurity risk assessment. Now, based on our prior conversation, it's probably not complete, but at least getting some thoughts on paper, crayon level sketches maybe. SBOM, vulnerability management, and post-market. I think thinking about those, post-market light touch because obviously you're not to market yet, but at least those four pillars are uh, critical to start thinking about at that time. So threat modeling, cybersecurity risk assessment, followed by vulnerability management, which I think includes SBOM. Um, I think we got another a question here going a little bit more technical about firmware signatures. Checking firmware signatures at boot in an embedded device can be time consuming. Can it be argued that it is only needed to check firmware signature at power on boot and subsequently only at device reset and of course at firmware update? Axel, thoughts?
Um, I mean, common best practice obviously would be to indeed check integrity at every boot. But as the question had stated here, there can be resource or other limitations that may lead you down a path of taking a different approach. Only check firmware at power on or system reset or after system update. So again, I mean, assume the general best practice would be check firmware integrity at every boot, but if there are performance, capability, benefit, or other trade-offs relative to risk, it's certainly okay to make those trade-offs if they are sufficiently justified and documented. So don't make that trade-off and don't tell the FDA about it. If you make the trade-off, document it, why you made that decision and why it was necessary, because you have a highly resource constrained device, because of timing criticality in the boot process, and so forth. So can you deviate? Yes, but if you deviate, document your rationale and make sure it is communicated.
Yeah, you touch on something super important and integral here, Axel, and that is we run into folks that are, and I understand, right? Like you're trying to get a product out the door and ship it. How can we justify not doing things, right? Like it makes total sense, right? It saves time and money. And I think as long as we're not using constraints to justify doing nothing, is a symptom of something that's not working and ultimately going to get you into trouble. So I think of like, the bar is okay, what's sort of best practice or standard practice? And I always go back to the risk assessment, and I say, is your risk assessment telling, are you saying you're not supposed to do anything? It's not to justify doing nothing, it's to justify the level of security, not no security, right? So when you think about this type of, boot process and like what's necessary, like what do security folks recommend as best practice? Because we just don't know all the risks that we're going to encounter. It's just good practice to prevent a whole host or collection or types of attacks. But as Axel said, like you are forced into a corner sometimes with certain choices. Like it's okay, just document it and say, hey, how does this you don't want to be hopefully you're not put in a position where you are exposing, I guess, actually your vernacular, your trade-off that exposes, say, like the crown jewels. Like you don't want a constraint to put you in a position where you're now exposing like, critical functions, right? Patient safety aspects and things like that. I think the trade-offs are okay in a less critical region of the device. So a little bit of a ramble there, but I think, leveraging best practice as you can, but hopefully not be putting into a position where you need to expose assets or data or functions or things like that that ultimately expose you to risk and patients to harm. Cool. Risk man, I think we're gonna pivot into risk management right here. So Naomi, this one's for you. Do we need to create a new cybersecurity risk matrix, or can we adapt our existing risk management file according to cybersecurity?
So I have seen people squeeze their cybersecurity risk management into their safety risk management. I have seen them do it successfully, and I've seen them fail spectacularly with FDA. FDA generally wants you to separate out these two processes. Think of it as two separate hands. My right hand over here is safety risk management, and it is governed by 14971. My left hand is cybersecurity risk management, and it is governed by a different set of standards because you are not using the methodology of 14971, which specifically asks you for probabilistic values. Oops, disconnect. Okay, so these two do not like each other because there's a different way to handle one of the two elements that you are multiplying out to figure your overall residual risk. What do you do about that? First of all, document them separately. Carry any safety risks from cyber risk over to the safety one with a note that says the quantitative or semi-quantitative values attributed to impact here and probability of occurrence are based on exploitability or likelihood of exploitation. They are not based on a probabilistic model. But if you have a 1-to-5 ratio for each characteristic on both of those, then you've got a 1-to-25 mapping of how bad is it, and they're not disjointed. That's my first comment. You want to keep them on the same scale so that when you carry them over to safety, if they have a safety impact, you can talk about it. Your initial assessment of the impact on the cybersecurity risk management side, though, should be based on impact to the data asset that's affected by a vulnerability, not safety. We're not talking about whether or not I can kill somebody yet. We're talking about what does the data mean to me? If the data is what is my glucose value and I'm going low, and you accidentally have data transferred in that says I'm going high, and so you dose me with more insulin, you're going to kill me. But we're not talking about the safety yet. We're saying the data itself. Is that data integrity so important? In this case, yes, it would be, that you've got to really assess that one as a high impact. Then you carry it over to safety and you say high impact to that data integrity means high impact to safety because look at all these other safety metrics that I have in my clinical analysis. Then you start talking about the actual impact to the patient there. But you're going to treat these two hands very differently. If you merge them together, which I have seen done, like I said, successfully and horribly, you run the risk of FDA calling you out and saying these should be done according to different paradigms. So probably don't do that. Again, ISO 14971 for safety, AMI TIR 57, AMI software 96. There are other methodologies you can use for the cybersecurity risk management.
And make sure you manage the relationship between the two, right? That you may make safety decisions that have security impact and vice versa, which is, to Naomi's point, spelled out in 57 and 96 quite extensively. But for example, you wouldn't put two-factor authentication on a defibrillator. That is a safety security trade-off decision that needs to be documented somewhere. Obviously, it was a trivial example, but you get my point.
Great, thank you. And then next question is triaging vulnerabilities across the lifecycle effectively. How are we using CVSS, EPSS, which is exploit prediction scoring system, VEX, vulnerability exchange. I think there's another word that goes on the end of there, but I forget at the moment. And other metrics to triage vulnerabilities according to likelihood or exploitability. Great question. I view vulnerability management as sort of a data science problem that's sort of an art, sort of a science. We talked about CVSS, and there are other sort of scoring systems that are trying to get the parameters of exploitability under control. And then, as somebody mentioned in the chat, there are versions of CVSS, both known and sort of home baked, sort of standard and home baked, to try to get to this idea like collateral damage, like what's the impact to the widgets that's running the software. We've most recently seen EPSS come on the scene, which is have to search the memory banks here, but basically it's a sort of data-driven, sort of what are we seeing in the wild composite score of, I think expressed in a percentage of what's the percentage likelihood that this thing is going to be exploited in the next 30 days based on what some major vendors of exploit detection systems and intrusion prevention and intrusion detection systems are running. Forget the name of those vendors, but then they sort of publish this data, hey, this CVE is getting exploited, and they give that to folks to use. What I will say, what I've seen in the medical space is that manufacturers will sort of note the percentage, but they won't necessarily say when EPSS gets above 70%, we act. What we tend to see is, hey, when CVSS is this, when EPSS is this, when we know that it's on the KEV list, and this is getting back to FDA policy, when we see that it is in Metasploit, we can sort of get a sense that this is probably a flag to raise and go look at this CVE right now. So I guess all of these collectively, I don't think anybody's sort of machine, automated what they do for these things, but they say, hey, we're going to take a closer look when the criteria are met. And then the follow-on Vex is a way to exchange that information, both what vulnerabilities are in your device, but also like what do you say about it. And I think what I've come to learn is you can use all the EPSS stuff in the world, but fundamentally it's the triage starts with the developers, the people that actually built the software, who know how the software works, the architects and folks that are involved in the engineering part of it, who can say, hey, what is the any impact of this particular vulnerability to my system? But right now, as I, you know, interface with manufacturers across the space, it's a super manual process right now. There are folks that are trying to automate it in various ways and having degrees of success. But in general, I find that we're still at the manual stage.
And then back to my point from earlier, there's also a big difference between pre and post market. Right? In pre-market, you really live in a world where you need to consider all future threats that may occur and all future incidents that may occur. So approaches like EPSS have less value because they give you today's view and you need to have a future view.
Thanks, Axel. We will be talking more about software bill of materials here down in the list. Oh, here we go. We are there. Documentation. Could you discuss? And that was quick. Could you discuss or show an example of the SBOM documentation that the FDA expects to review? Is it just a big, I'm going to add this in, this person didn't submit this. Is it just a big old list of TPSCs, which, what do we define TPSCs as? I forget.
Third-party
Third
software
parties,
packages,
software code or
components.
components. Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Yes. Why didn't the third come to mind? Anyway, Naomi, you want to give this a shot?
Yeah, it is more than just a big list of TPSCs. Specifically, FDA's guidance tells you that they want you to include the minimum elements. They also reference end of support dates and level of support. So, Kent, we're going to get to your question now. There are significant numbers of third-party and open source components that are in use where those two fields are not necessarily available. I jokingly tell people, but it's not really a joke. I went and looked for the end of support date for my Mac OS on my MacBook. Guess what? Apple doesn't tell you that. What? Really? No, really. Apple doesn't tell you that. I think Europe did something where they threatened to sue them, and eventually Apple and Google promised to actually give, approximate support end of support dates for mobile phone operating systems, right? Because they kind of have the market cornered, and because they should be telling people like, how long can you keep your phone so that you can actually make good decisions about buying a new one. Um, but what do you do when you can't get this information? And yes, FDA actually wants you to go and find it for all the things. That's not entirely right though. And I asked Jessica Wilkerson this question at Amy Nexus last year because I wanted to hear her response, and I suspected I already knew the answer. What they really want you to do here is to tell them when you don't know something, what you can do about it. So if you do know the actual end of support date and level of support that you're getting for a component, tell them, like, this is it. Here I have it. I got it from a website, right? You know it. When you don't know it, go threat model that sucker. What would go wrong if this is not a critical component in your medical device for its essential performance or its basic safety? Maybe you can lump it into a category where you say this and 15 other software components don't really impact anything other than my ability to generate a bunch of log files that I, as the manufacturer, care about, or that affects my IP or something like that. But it doesn't affect safety and essential performance. And then you can say, well, what more information can I find? Well, it's been updated sometime in the last 6 months, or it's been updated 3 times in the last year, or it hasn't been updated in 10 years. Uh-oh, I need to start worrying about it. Can I fork it and manage it myself if it's open source? Like, what are my options here? So threat model it. What are we doing? What could go wrong? Do I have any controls and things like that? And did I do a good enough job? That's what you got to do there. But if you're using off-the-shelf software, open source or otherwise, FDA's OTS guidance asks for some other stuff. So title and manufacturer, fine, that's classic NTIA minimum elements. Version level, release date, patch number, upgrade designation as appropriate. Okay, sometimes I can get that, sometimes I cannot. Any OTS software documentation that will be provided to the end user. Most of the end users don't want to look at that, but okay, if you're going to provide some, you know, you got to put it in your labeling. Why is the OTS software appropriate for the medical device? That's tricky, like, because it was the only way to do it. I don't know. Some of the questions in the OTS guidance are a little bit open-ended, and they're trying to get you to say something reasonable, right? What are the expected design limitations of the OTS software? Again, like what? Why is FDA asking that question? They want you to threat model it. They want you to think about what could go wrong if you're using this drawing package versus that drawing package. How do I render an image as part of my user interface? It might matter. It might actually matter. So you have to think about those things and consider how they affect you. What do you do about it when you can't get those pieces of data? You threat model them and then you tell FDA, this information is not available, that this is what I could find, and this is what I can do about it if I can't find any evidence that this thing is supported. Maybe I haven't determined that the person who wrote the code is dead. If they are dead, like you got a real problem, but you know, that's the approach.
Thanks, Naomi. Yeah, I think not leaving to Kent's question, not leaving things blank is probably the yeah. Did you do some at least some due diligence, whatever you found right there? I believe we already answered this question, so I think we'll skip it over, but I'll just note it for posterity. What documentation, how to organize for cybersecurity versus safety risks, especially in existing cleared products. I think we covered documentation sufficiently here, so moving on. In connection with prior approval supplement. Wow, I'm over my skis, Naomi. This guy has to go to you. For a device that was approved before 29th of March 2023, which I believe we're referring to post law passage. I don't know why am I forgetting? Consolidated Appropriations Act. Uh, must the cybersecurity management documentation be submitted in accordance with the old or the new guidance?
Yeah, so fundamentally, it doesn't matter when you submitted the original part of the package that was reviewed. What matters is you're submitting something new to FDA and they're reviewing it today. Not last week, not last year, not a decade ago. They're reviewing it today. Today, everything that applies is written into guidance and is finalized before today. If it's not finalized before today, I don't care about it because it's draft, right? But if it's final and it's guidance, or worse, it's statute and it's under 524B, you should be applying it today if you're submitting today. It doesn't matter if it's a PAS, you know, PASs are typically associated with BLAs and NDAs. So we're talking more, you know, there's some drug device thing where the drug is the driver. But if you're providing data supporting safety and effectiveness, and you're now talking about a device that's involved and it's a cyber device, your bar is not safety and effectiveness, it's safety, effectiveness, and security.
Thank you, Naomi. I see there's a question about software composition analysis. We think we have a question about some additional SBOM stuff below. I'll get to it then. Um, question about SAMD, software as a medical device. What should the table of contents include for a set of cybersecurity docs, policies, procedures for cloud-based SAMD applications? I like to refer to this as the treasure map. Sorry for the. I had to. I had to. Go ahead, Naomi. Take this one.
Yeah, so we've had this conversation before about submissions that go to FDA that aren't well organized and well structured, and FDA spends a lot of time doing the needle in a haystack review, which is really ugly. If you are submitting via eStar, it already basically lays out your table of contents for you, and you just attach documents where they tell you to. So it kind of simplifies that whole idea of how do I write a good, clear table of contents? If you're submitting without using eStar, guess what? Use the eStar as a guideline for what your table of contents should look like, because FDA is looking for pieces and discrete elements that they know how to map to, you know, the guidance. And if you do something different, that's fine, but it might take them longer to actually figure out where you put it and how to associate it back to the guidance. So either structure it based on the guidance itself or structure it based on eStar, which, by the way, is optional today for a de novo, but will be mandatory soon, and eventually will be mandatory as well for a PMA. So, eStar is there for a reason. Leverage it. But let's talk about the cloud-based SAMD specific aspect of the question. There is, in my opinion, very little difference between a SAMD and a SIMD, software in or software as a medical device. Because either way, you have your software operating in some ecosystem somewhere on some hardware. No actual software runs in the ether yet, as far as I know. So somewhere there's a platform for this thing. Who owns it? That's a good question. How you document who owns it and what they're doing with it, that's important to capture. The fact that it's cloud-based versus on-prem, don't really care. The one thing here is if it's cloud-based and you're not owning the cloud yourself, you got to document what the people who do own the cloud are doing. So here you want to make sure that you document what service you're receiving from your cloud service provider, what testing they do, what testing you do in order to show that you're receiving, all of the quality you need from the CSP, or that you're implementing it yourself, and that you are tracing. I had a requirement. The controls are coming from them or me, and I tested it or they tested it, and here's how it all fits together into the end-to-end aspect. Even if the cloud-based SAMD is only part of your medical device ecosystem, it needs to be covered in your documentation, end-to-end. And you should threat model the aspects that reside in the cloud. If it's the whole thing, you got to threat model the assets and interfaces in the cloud. If only part of your device is in the cloud, it still needs to be part of your threat model.
Great points, Naomi. Folks tend to be like, why do I have to do this for my AWS resources? And folks get questions all the time about it. I do recognize we've got 12 minutes here. We've got quite a few more questions to get through. So we're going to enter now ludicrous speed or mode, I guess, for the webinar. So here we go. This one's related to threat modeling for Naomi for supply chain threat modeling and supply chain risk management content in 510Ks. What feedback have you observed from the FDA? Has the feedback been anything other than, hey, you didn't do this, go do it? What others have you observed?
Yeah, absolutely. The first obvious one is, hey, you just didn't do threat modeling for supply chain, in which case go do it. Sometimes the feedback is that the threat model includes some information but doesn't account for supply chain considerations. Sometimes it gets more detailed and goes into specific supply chain risks. So here's an example, and this is actually out of somebody's deficiency letter or interactive review, I forget which. Please provide the level of support and end of support date, blah, 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 section 4A, 5A4 of the guidance. If you are unable to find the end of support date for these components, you should demonstrate the existence of appropriate mechanisms for assuring the continued maintenance and support of the OTS software should the original OTS developer terminate their support. In addition, you should address these risks to the system by updating the device to a supported platform that can receive security updates throughout the expected life of the device. That's literally what we've seen from FDA, verbatim. So it feeds back to what we said before about what you can do about it. You need to threat model it, and you need to have a plan, whether it's migrating and running it yourself and maintaining it yourself, or going and finding a different package. Those are options. There may be other options as well.
Great, thank you. And for Axel, sort of an offshoot about how do we know what we're doing is sort of sufficient? If it's present, how do we know we're doing a good job about it? What threat model scoring attributes do you believe are sufficient for risk scoring potential threats or level of support, end of support for all SBOM items?
I mean, we need to understand and define what threat modeling is. It is a risk assessment methodology that gets applied early on in the architecture and design stage of a product, right? So nobody has written a line of code. Nobody has tied together third-party software components. You're just putting the building blocks together on your whiteboard. And how do you, in that stage, then assess risk? And how do you, in that stage, mitigate risk? And threat modeling is the preferred methodology to do that, because it allows you to articulate what you're building, allows you to articulate the risks that come with your architecture and make changes to your architecture that allow you to reduce your risks. So from a scoring methodology, I wouldn't approach threat modeling any different than I would also approach traditional risk assessment. What you have, likelihood that a certain event occurs, and you have then the impact of that given event, and that's the same two parameters you would assess there. But the difference is, again, you're still in a very abstract stage. But in the end, once you have your architecture refined and you're satisfied with the security of that architecture, you most likely still have a number of acceptable risks left, right? And they then need to be carried over into your risk assessment and may need to be addressed in other ways other than architectural changes. So for example, somebody implements specific security controls to mitigate that particular risk because it couldn't be addressed architecturally. That makes sense.
So I want to take this time to then answer the question in the Q&A. What does the function of SCA actually, and does it create a software bill of materials? Fundamentally, a software composition analysis tool or process is generating or analyzing the software applications that are running on a system. It could be embedded open source components. It could be a wide variety of different software components. But you're looking at what is actually in there. You're trying to identify open source and third-party packages as well as the packages that you built yourself and put onto something. Different tools are differently able to do that, and different ecosystems are more difficult to do it in than others. Some SCA tools also claim to do vulnerability analysis. I would caution trying to use the same tool to generate your SBOM as the tool to do your vulnerability analysis, because if it misses a component as it's generating the SBOM, it's going to miss any vulnerabilities associated with that component. I have seen this go horribly wrong for manufacturers. It can help you determine licensing, which is often very important from a legal perspective and an IP perspective. So you can use it to generate an SBOM, but you also want to sanity check it with your development team and make sure that it didn't miss something really big like an operating system, which sometimes they miss. If you have an OS on your system, sometimes they offer recommendations for remediation, so you have to be careful with that too, because if it missed something, it's not going to tell you to remediate something that is vulnerable, and now you have a problem. So be careful about selecting tools. Make sure that they're fit for purpose for the environment you're building in. But yes, you can use SCA to create an SBOM.
Great, thank you, Naomi. Moving right along here, pen testing. What are the standards and regulations that govern pen testing, Axel?
I just want to re-emphasize a point I made earlier, right? That we are here talking about processes and practices to produce secure products, and some of the things we do in product security and how we think about questions in product security is different than how it is done in traditional IT/enterprise/web/software security. That forward-looking mindset, for example, I have a vulnerability, whether a threat against that vulnerability exists or not, doesn't matter. It will exist at some point in the future, I have to assume. So having reiterated that, if you look around for pen testing resources, bear in mind that most of the things that are out there are written for the traditional IT/network/web type of environment, right? NIST 800-115 is a good security testing framework, but it is written for the general IT, not for the product environment. So you can use it certainly, but need to adapt it. There is a P-test, the penetration testing execution standard, or ISAF, the information system security assessment framework, again, written for general network and web penetration testing. So you need to adapt those. However, there are things out there that came out over the last couple of years that start to shift into our direction, into the direction of product security. OWASP, for example, that is OWASP. They have a number of frameworks, including some for mobile application pen testing, right? If you have an SAMD that runs on a mobile device, that is quite useful. API pen testing that helps you to test your integration interfaces. Or even OWASP provides an IoT pen testing guidance document that you can use that is probably very much applicable to what we're doing in the medical device space. Another good one to look at is the MITRE ATT&CK methodology. It is somewhat abstracted, but nevertheless, it does allow you to think in common attack patterns, right? In common attack methodologies. And MITRE has recently released, well, recently over the last year or two, specific versions of the attack framework that address specific use cases. For example, there is now an attack framework for mobile devices and mobile applications. And there's also an attack framework for ICS, industrial control system environments, which again, I believe is probably closer to what we're doing in the medical device space than other, let's say, general IT practices.
Great, thank you, Axel. And now we have the awesome duty to cover all of EU regulations in the next 3 minutes. But I digress. I'm saying that in jest. Anything we don't get to in terms of questions, we will send to you via email. With that said, we have a question about EU regulations here. I would like to know the gap between FDA security requirement and EU CE mark security requirement. Axel, do you want to take a first stab at this?
Sure. And I mean, there are a number of things. It's one of those good news, bad news stories, right? The good news is that directionally, EU and FDA are fairly aligned. Both markets require secure development processes. They require security risk management process, post-market risk management. They provide for evidence and testing and documentation demonstrating that you indeed designed a secure device. Both also apply a fairly broad definition of applicability of what qualifies of a medical device that needs to meet cybersecurity requirements, right? So never mind particular language, but both markets say that, hey, if you have a device that has a way of getting data in and out of the device, doesn't matter whether it is standard TCP/IP network, Bluetooth, proprietary network, USB thumb drive, doesn't matter. At that point, you need to apply cybersecurity considerations, right? So again, those are things where I think both markets are directionally aligned. There are, of course, differences. They are more in the specifics. For example, here in the US, your market approval goes through the organization that actually provides the regulations, meaning that is the FDA, right? FDA wrote the pre and post-market cybersecurity guidances, and FDA will review your submission for cybersecurity. In the EU, that is fundamentally different. MDR and IVDR are basically laws at the level of the European Union, but market approval is managed by notified bodies that are authorized to approve products for the market within the EU. Then you get to companies like TUV or UL and other companies that are allowed to do that work. Another difference is that MDR and IVDR really don't get deep into cybersecurity, right? They define what your medical device has to fulfill for it to be considered approved in the European market. They point to cybersecurity through adopted standards. Doesn't matter whether it's 13485 as your quality system or 81001-5-1 for your overall cybersecurity lifecycle management. Whereas the FDA, yes, they do have a list of recognized standards, but they actually provide cybersecurity guidance in dedicated documents, the pre and post market guidances, and not through, again, pointing at existing standards. And FDA also tends to be more prescriptive, whereas in Europe, it's a lot of interpretation you need to do in order to figure out, what you should apply. What else is important? I think right now, where we are today in 2025, there are interesting things happening in the EU that are not happening in the US yet. For example, I have heard recently that EU is actually, or the notified bodies rather on behalf of the EU, is performing unannounced site visits and audits, including audits for cybersecurity. So I think that is where EU is clearly taking a lead over what FDA is doing currently. Another area where I think FDA differs is that they have very specific requirements that are not as explicit in the EU. For example, FDA, as we discussed, has very specific requirements on SBOM, what needs to be in it, has very specific requirements on your security architecture views, has very specific requirement on post-market metrics. And then last point I want to make is sometimes the difference is very subtle, even though, for example, EU calls it post-market surveillance plan and FDA calls it a post-market management plan. Content-wise, they're different, but they're called by a different name. So therefore, as you submit different documents, different practices, different evidence in the EU or here in the US, be sure that you use the correct nomenclature for those documents you're submitting.
Thank you so much, Axel. I'm sure there's a lot more to talk about. In fact, we have some additional questions specifically about submitting to notified bodies, which we'll send out an email. I'd like to thank our guests today. Thank you so much for hanging on for the extra few minutes. Thank you for your time and attention and questions. Hopefully these were helpful to you. If you ever have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to the three of us. Thank you, Axel. Thank you, Naomi. Cheers.
Thanks everyone for joining, and
Thanks, everyone.
thank you, Seth, for hosting.
Oh, no problem. Take care. Bye-bye.